Okay, and thanks for joining me, Chuck Morse here. My guest is Richard Spencer. Richard is the president of the National Policy Institute, described as a white supremacist think tank, which is a definition that you do not accept, Richard. Thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thanks for having me on, Chuck. I appreciate it.
Okay, Richard, look, my main issue here is I just before the show, I got an email from a Republican group talking about how much Louis Farrakhan has made inroads into the Democratic Party, and how there's a group of congressmen that seem to embrace him, and has an affiliation with the Congressional Black Caucus. He even had these pictures of him out with former President Barack Obama, and I would describe him as a black nationalist. I mean, even as a black supremacist. And my concern is that between him and between you, which seems to be that you're a counterpart as a white man, I just am concerned that this country could be facing or be moving into a race war. What say you?
Well, I don't think you're wrong when you say that. I do think it's clear that the United States is fragmenting, and it's being polarized on the left and the right. That's clear. But it's also being fragmented among racial and to some degree cultural lines as well. There's actually a tremendous amount of animosity between whites. The animosity between many urban liberal whites and rural whites is almost a intra-race war of its own. But the fact is, America has moved from what was effectively a white Christian country. Americans, in the 20th century, at least, we haven't had an identitarian consciousness that is similar to, say, Czechs or Germans or French or something like that. We have had a broader consciousness, and Americans also, very much like the French, actually, have a kind of Enlightenment era constitutional identity of what does it mean to be an American. It means to have tenets and believe in some kind of variation of classical Judaism and so on. But the fact is, identity, racial identity, ethnic identity, and other forms of identity, cultural, are reasserting themselves. And the fact is, America went from being a kind of republic to being a empire. I'm wondering if it's now becoming just an economy. What brings everyone together in the United States? The fact that we all like to watch football or watch a comic book film, or we all want to make money. There doesn't seem to be a common core bringing us together where we feel like we're part of one extended family. The fact is, there is a lot of racial animosity. I am not the one causing it. Louis Farrakhan is not the one causing it. It is a outcome of a long-term historical development, and it cannot be stopped. I am just the beginning of the awakening of white racial consciousness, and really, I'm not just the beginning. That's to give me too much credit. There are many people who came before me, but there are going to be more and more people who sound like Richard Spencer, who sound like other white identitarians in the future. It is an outcome of history. It's not something that I'm causing or that Louis Farrakhan is causing.
Well, I mean, I reject the idea that there's some kind of an inevitability to history. I think it's something that we as human beings can mold by ideas. And I do think that you and Louis Farrakhan are contributing to a race identity. It's not just you guys. It's also kind of this hyper identity movement on college campuses with the microaggression movement and whatnot, that people are being encouraged to identify themselves based upon this nebulous idea of race, as opposed to what the American conception was, and I think still is, which is to the individual under God. The right and the government is limited, and that American culture is something that transcends any particular race. If you take a look, for example, at the diary of John Adams, he talks about how America was made up of, back then, what they thought of as different races and ethnic groups and religions. I mean, they didn't consider Swedes to be white, actually, but yet that it was an amazing amalgam of people. And I suppose that the definition of what is white is something that has evolved over time. So I want to get to that. Who is white, in your opinion?
What white is a broad concept. It is a biological concept, no question. This is not a concept that is particularly controversial among serious geneticists. But I would say, culturally speaking, there is a core Europe that would include Slavs, that would include Anglo-Saxons, that would include Celts, that would include people of Mediterranean origin, and so on. Just because a concept, or particularly a biological concept, has somewhat fuzzy borders here and there, are the Armenians white or something like that, doesn't mean that there actually isn't a core concept. And I think also what I would stress with whiteness is that it is a cultural concept just as much as it is a biological concept. One could argue that Iranians are white. The word Iran means Aryan, after all. Certainly, a large part of the Arab world has Caucasian DNA. But at the same time, there's a cultural component to all this as well. There is a core Europe that not only makes up Western, Central, and Eastern Europe, but also makes up the people who founded the United States of America. In terms of the American question, if I may, first off, I agree that there was a lot of heady Enlightenment and in many ways egalitarian rhetoric among the founding fathers. But we have to recognize two important factors. First off, this is a very white thing, you could say. This world, this intellectual world that birthed the American founding, is birthed from an Anglo-Saxon Protestant context, and to a broader sense, a European, or even French, you could say, Enlightenment concept. It is deeply white. And whether these ideas can be dissociated from the people that gave birth to them and just projected upon the world is questionable. This is one of my major criticisms of a lot of the Americanist ideology. But let's also remember a couple of things. The John Jay actually had a famous quote where he thanked, this was in the Federalist Papers, he thanked God that he brought together this new nation whose future was in jeopardy. But he brought together this new nation that worshipped the same God, that had the same culture and the same background. He wasn't just referring to white Christians, he was referring to Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And that was the core population of the United States. The first Immigration Act of 1790 limited immigration to white people of good character. And that certainly included Swedes, that certainly included the Irish. There's some of these myths about how people didn't think the Irish were white or something like that. The United States was a white country. Even in all of this immigration, the great waves of immigration that came in the 19th century, and particularly after the Civil War, America did become less of an Anglo-Saxon Protestant country, and it became a white Christian country. And there's no question that ethnic differences are real. One, the fact that there are
well, I want to get into that in a minute because we're going into so many topics here. So, I mean, first of all, yes, I mean, America was founded by Britain and by the Anglo-Saxons, but the fact that, or whether or not they are genetically white, I mean, I don't see how that's relevant. It has more to do with the fact that the Anglo-Saxons embraced certain cultural ideas that in particularly included limited government. If you take a look at how they divided up powers in the country and how they limited powers after the Magna Carta. And the fact that they were white, ethnically, genetically, I just don't see that as being relevant to anything. It's not, it's a kind of they embraced ideas that transcend any particular race. And I think that's something that the founding generation understood and recognized, and that they rejected Europe. That's why they came here. They established a nation that would not have this central power, this divine right of kings, but that sovereignty would come from God. As Jefferson said, the creator is the grantor of inalienable rights. And that the idea was that the individual would be sovereign under God, and that government would be limited and would protect those rights. and that these are principles that are universal. Any nation, any culture, any race, if we must be as vulgar as have to talk about people's race, that they can embrace these principles and adapt them to whatever local nation or culture they have, or not adapt them if they don't want to. But the point is that America was founded on ideals and principles. The fact that people happen to have white genes, I don't see how that's really relevant to anything.
The founders obviously did not believe that their ideals were applicable to all races of mankind. They certainly did not believe that these ideals were applicable to Negro slaves or.
And they were wrong about that, weren't they? I mean, look, yes,
okay,
they didn't.
So the founders were wrong. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, well, I'm saying, look, they're not perfect, but I'm pointing out that this was the great flaw in their thinking at the time. And even in that context, they ultimately did believe that these ideas were universal. But, to the degree that they didn't extend them to, African Americans, obviously is wrong. I mean, unless you think slavery is a good idea. I mean, the point that the idea of eventually a one individual owning another individual like their chattel is something that's, it's now understood, quite frankly, to be wrong, and that it was a mistake that was corrected by a civil war.
Okay. I mean, there's a lot to unpack here. First off, the American Revolution was not fought against the concept of the divine right of kings. First off, after the Glorious Revolution, the king himself was not truly sovereign in Britain. The Parliament was sovereign. But beyond that, they were in this new world in which a new form of sovereignty had to be legitimized. And the current ideas of the day, the most vanguard, powerful ideas were Enlightenment ideas. They were floating. These ideas were floating around. These were taken in order to justify the creation of a new order. But at the end of the day, people like Washington, Jefferson, and so on were aristocratic planters. They were slave holders. They could never imagine a situation in which we have a multiracial or multicultural country, and they certainly couldn't imagine a situation in which blacks, Negro slaves had the right to vote or were considered citizens or something like that.
Well, first of all, there was a divide in the country at the time because people like Alexander Hamilton were abolitionists and were anti-slavery.
Many people were abolitionists.
I mean, it was an argument that was involved at the time of the founding of the Constitution, and that there was, I think, a compromise made only because they put the interests of unity over the interests of abolishing slavery. But clearly they wanted to abolish slavery. That's why they put into the constitutional text the end of the slave trade by 1809. And that ultimately, even though they didn't do it, they saw this as something that was not a good institution and that would have to eventually be abolished. And, this was the progression of American culture has been the enfranchisement of its citizens. I mean, over time, the enfranchisement of African Americans after the Civil War, the enfranchisement of women with the right to vote. This is part of the American ethos. It's a very basic philosophical precept, which is that individuals have sovereign rights. And that,
America is, as a conservative, and as someone, I'm just, we've never met before, but I'm just looking of what I can see from your video screen. You have actually some nice antiques in your room. I appreciate that. You're a very reasonable and civilized man. I think actually you and I probably have a lot in common in terms of taste and so on. You might hate my views, don't worry. But in terms of someone you might want to have lunch with, I think we actually have a lot in common. Do you think that the United States of America is really headed in the right direction? Because you first called upon the founders, and then you started calling upon this progress. This is how America has progressed. Do you think that we love each other more now as a nation? Do you think that we're headed towards greater solvency, you could say, as a government, towards greater civility, to a higher culture that you would want to pass down to your grandchildren? Do you think that this progress we've made in this direction has been good, or not?
Yes, I do, but I think that it's being torn at the edges by movements such as both yours and Louis Farrakhan's, which are focusing on such inane ideas as people's birth genetics, as opposed to individual achievement, which is the American ethos. Now, I want to bring things up to the present day here. You have talked about an ethno racial America. You have talked about changing the Declaration of Independence. What kind of America? I mean, first of all, what sort of a nation would you have, and what happens to people in that nation who don't test out as being, as you define it, white?
Well, let me say one thing. You say something, I think you used the word inane, and then earlier in the conversation, you used the word vulgar, something as vulgar as race.
Yes, I do.
Let me address that first, and then I'll address your direct question about the concept of the ethno-state, and so on. Race is fundamentally an extended family. That is, a race will develop, whether we're talking about a dog breed, a species of animal, or a race of mankind. These will develop when there is a large community, very often separated due to geography or so on, that engages in interbreeding so that it becomes an extended family. Our consciousness, our sense of morality, and so on, arose in a context in which we were in a tribe of basically cousins, that we thought that we would have to deal with everyone again and again, and that we actually have to shoot them straight each time because we're all part of this team. So this is what race is. It is basically an extended family. Do you think the fact that you were born from your father and your mother is vulgar, or that it is inane in the sense that it is totally irrelevant to who you are? My guess is that you look a lot like your father. My guess is that you might have some traits of your mother that are actually innate, for good and for ill. I inherited my father's temper. I inherited a lot of things from my mother in terms of sensibility and so on. This is who we are. And it's actually, we're born into something. We don't just simply choose our individual identity. We are born into something that really is the foundation of our individuality. So, I mean, I can't believe as a
Well, no, I reject that. First of all, I mean, my ethnic background is personal. It's there, but it is a personal matter, and how I relate to it is, or not relate to it, is a personal thing. And that, in a sense, you say that we're tribal and that we're all, related by, in terms of being cousins, in the broad sense. That is checked and balanced by an anti-nepotism idea, which is that individuals competing in the free market eventually are going to have to get ahead based upon their accomplishments and their skills, not just family connections. I mean, that's part of it, sure, but that's, as a matter of public policy, as a matter of a nation state. Those things are, they're personal. How people relate to them is personal. You have to go out and achieve something because of who you are, and you have to make connections with people that can help you based upon who they are, not necessarily because it's a relative, but because they're involved in a similar field that you're involved in, or you want to have, a romantic relationship, or personal friendships, or professional relationships. These things are done by you as an individual because it's out of your self-interest, not just because someone's related to you, because someone's a cousin. I mean, those things, I suppose, are important to many people. I value those things, but I do so because it's personal. It's not a matter, I suppose we're talking about the separation of personal and political here.
Well, okay, a couple of things. First off, these things that you say are just purely personal. I think you're trying to diminish their importance. I am who I am fundamentally because I was born into a family. I look like my father. I look like my sibling. I look like my mother. I have
Yeah, but
certain
why is it
personality
relevant? I mean,
traits.
I'm not
It's
diminishing
not
it. I'm
just.
just,
And the other thing is, I've had certain advantages in my life because of what I was born into. You could call this privilege if you want. I am not simply an individual atom operating in a free market. Secondly, I care about people. In terms of one of the things that might rub you the wrong way about what I believe is not just the race thing, but actually the fact that I don't believe in we should have this pure free market. Sink or swim. I guess you should fight as hard as you can, and if you starve, tough luck, fella. I don't believe that, actually. I
neither do
believe
I. No, that's as false a construct as communism is. I mean, the free market and capitalism and American, rights are tempered by local community concerns, by local government, and by morality, by belief
why
in.
do we care? Why would a local government, like, put aside the welfare state? I agree with you. There's a tremendous amount of ill with the welfare state. Why would, in your idealized world, why would a local government have some kind of, say, charity for the homeless, charity for people who are down on their
Because it's
luck,
part of
alcoholics,
because
or
a burned in
charity for a
aspect
woman
of.
who was beaten by her husband?
Yeah, because it's kind of a hidebound aspect of human nature that we care about our fellow citizen and that we want to help people
Citizen,
who are in need.
we care
Yeah.
about our families and our towns
No,
and
no, we get no. I
our
Some people do,
tribes.
some people don't. That may describe you.
Citizenship is a
That
very new concept, and to be honest,
goes back
I
to
think
Roman
that
times,
potentially
and
what
it goes back to the Romans, and some people don't care. I agree with that, but my point is that you don't need necessarily government to make people care about the welfare of their neighbors. That's something that most people want to do, and that there's a role for the local government in it in terms of whether or not people want that role. I'm not
I more or
disputing
less
that.
agree with I more or less agree with that. What I'm saying is that why do you care about your family more than you care about strangers? I would do things for people who are in my immediate family that you could say favors or help or whatever that I would never do
So would
for
I, but the point is that's my freedom to do that. It's not. I don't need the.
it's
It's
not
not a
an
matter of public
individual
policy.
choice.
You want to help your immediate family first, and then your community second. That's just part
everyone
of.
just happens to choose this. This sense of identity, which
And
is
some people don't
fundamental
choose it.
is
That's their
the most
business. It's a
natural thing
freedom
in the
matter.
world. It's the most natural thing in the world. It comes like the
Yeah,
morning
but you want
dew.
to codify it as part of government, and you want to say this family. I want to get into your conception right at this point about what you
Okay, let me say
see.
one quick thing, real quick.
Yeah,
You can think that your race is purely personal, but the fact is it's not, and it will never be personal. People are going to under the other that is for other races and so on. They are going to view you as white, whether you like it or not. You can talk all day
fine. They
about
might. I pass as white, but the point is that whether or not it's personal and whether or not people view me in a racial context, I don't see that necessarily. I see that as a part of human nature, but not necessarily the good part of human nature. I don't want to enforce that with government, by codifying that as part of our government. Yeah,
if
we
you
view
ignore
people
this
based upon their race,
reality.
but we view people in that way. Different people view people in different ways based on that. I mean, it's not. It's not, as a matter of public policy, we should not be viewing people based on their race.
Do you
People.
think that people are obsessed with race in the world? That race is the whole culture, even political scandals like the NFL anthem controversy. Do you think these are just shot through with race? Do you think so?
Well, yeah, race is it's obviously a major issue, but the point is that the answer to that isn't to make race a law, whether it be left or right. The answer
Why
is
is it
to.
so powerful? Because it's so real. It speaks to people. Whenever I talk with
It's
African
powerful because there's
Americans,
been inequality. That's why it's powerful. I mean, this country has been a white supremacist country, anyways. I mean, that's just. I mean, it's a fact of life. The white race. I mean, it's been it's been supreme.
right?
I'm getting into something more fundamental here, though, which is, in a sense, why? I mean, do you think that there's something superior about people who are genetically white? I mean, do you think that people of color are not able to function in an American society just like you are? I mean, as individuals?
Well, I would say this. I'll put aside the question of superiority. The real issue is difference. We
Okay.
evolved in different contexts.
But how do
However,
you qualify that difference? I mean, do you think that you're
I will. In terms of are whites better qualified and innately qualified to succeed and flourish in what America was throughout in the 18th, 19th, and even in much of the 20th century? There's no question.
Oh, I
that that
reject that. I
that
mean,
does
the fact that people happen to be predominantly white in this country is not relevant. It's a coincidence. If a black African, I'll tell you why. If a black African tribe had embraced Judeo-Christian values, Greco-Roman law, all of these things that eventually became part of European civilization, then they would have been able to have probably colonized the United States. The race is not relevant. The relevant issue is the fact that for whatever reason, historically, Europe and Western civilization embraced ideas that are universal, but they happen to embrace them first. Now, you say that you're going into the past and looking at that, Europe embraced these ideas, but that's the past. That's not today.
Ideas come from. Ideas
They come from
never
that,
just
and by the way, they come from the Hebrew
us.
Bible, and the Hebrews were not white. But
the Hebrew Bible is not really the foundation of liberalism. That's pretty absurd.
It's part of it.
Not really.
It's the Judeo-Christian moral code is the basis of American constitutional law. Yes, it is. I stand by that. But the point I'm making is that in today's world, civilization has moved on to the point where these ideas not only are available to all peoples in the world, and certainly all peoples in this country, regardless of their ethnic background, but they've embraced them. I mean, if you go outside of your circle, you might notice that people of all ethnic backgrounds are accomplishing things, and they're just as American in the sense as that they're just as strong an individual as you are, that their race is not relevant. It's relevant to them personally, maybe it isn't. But in the bigger picture of Western civilization, it's not. It never was, but it's more obvious now.
I am sure that you can find some high IQ Indians who immigrate to the United States and become doctors and live in the suburbs and watch Netflix. Congratulations. I don't think that proves anything. The real question is, would Notre Dame Cathedral arise in India? Would it arise in China?
We're talking history again. We're talking, you're in the past.
Yeah, history is relevant.
But history changes. The point is that for whatever reason, Europe did develop, and by the way, India has the Taj Mahal, but
but it's not Notre Dame.
They have magnificent buildings in the Islamic world too. But the point is that America developed as an offshoot of Western civilization, where it did emerge in Europe. That's just a fact of history. The fact that these people happen to be white is not all that relevant. It's a fact of history that we've progressed to the point where American ideals that have been codified in this country are available to everyone, and that anyone, regardless of their ethnic background, can thrive by embracing these ideas. There's nothing uniquely white about them. The fact that, are you suggesting that only white people can embrace Western civilizational ideas and succeed?
If you want to define Western civilization as engaging in capitalism and getting rich and
Judeo-Christian moral codes, yes.
This is Judeo-Christian,
which you reject, by the way. I understand that you don't like Christianity.
I have a complicated view of Christianity. To say that I don't like it, I think is
okay. Maybe I'm simplifying, but the point is, you seem to, you're not exactly. You're not integrating the Judeo-Christian moral code into, besides the founding of the Republic, what's made us who we are, regardless of whether we happen to be Christian or Jewish. That's beside the point.
There's no question that I am deeply influenced, personally speaking. My worldview, my conception of history of everything is deeply influenced by Christianity. There's no question.
Fine.
And but Christianity is deeply influenced by Europe. Christianity, the Judeo-Christianity. First off, Christianity negated the covenant between God and the Jews. I think some Christian Zionists seem to
Oh,
be
I will.
mistaken.
That's a whole different subject. I
But
mean, and as a Jew, I reject
very
that. By the way,
obvious. But
yeah,
why would you reject it as a Jew?
because I'm a Jew, and I don't think that the covenant between God and Israel is never negated.
Well, of course
It's
you don't.
the
I'm saying that
Christianity is
that's the
grafted into the
perception.
covenant, but the covenant, as Jesus said in the book of Acts, the covenant between of the Torah is forever, and he meant forever. We can get into a religious
Let's not get into
conversation,
the weeds.
but
Christianity, what became Christianity, was deeply Europeanized. The original Christianity was certainly a Jewish phenomenon. There's no question about it, and our ability to access the, say, historical Jesus, what he actually believed, is extremely difficult. And so on. But what we can access is how Christianity developed over time in Europe. It became a European religion. It was Germanized to a very strong degree. It was also paganized to a very strong degree. It inherited the imperial structure of the Roman Empire, and so on. It became a European concept. It was culturally appropriated.
well, there's Christianity in Africa too, and there's Christianity in the Middle East. I mean, it's not really all that different.
Different
Not
because
really.
of, oh my God, are you joking? They're
I mean, they
radically
had to exist under the oppression of Islamic control, but no, I don't think,
Do you think voodoo is the
there are
same
cultural
thing as
differences,
Episcopalianism?
but in its core, Christianity embraced the moral and ethical code of the Old Testament, or the Torah, and that's been an idea that has animated the development of the individual under God, not a tribal idea. It's not a collectivist idea, which is what you're into. It's
Do
not
you
this
think
idea that
no? Do
somehow we're
Jews of the
endowed
Old
because of our
Testament
ethnic background. I don't see
the
anything
Jews of
like
the
that
Old
in
Testament
Christianity.
are the
Show me
most
where in Christianity it says
tribal.
that white people are, because of their ethnic background. It's a personal relationship with Jesus as Christ. It's not
I would never
regardless of who
say.
you are. That's the
I would never.
concept.
Okay, in terms of the New Testament, I would never say that it is a white supremacist document. That's ridiculous. In
Okay.
terms of the Old Testament, the idea that the Jews that we learn universal individualism from the Torah is absurd. This
Oh
is
no,
the most
it's
tribal.
they were tribal in that they
Jews
believed that they were.
outdid me in terms of tribalism. It's
Well,
not even a
this is
contest.
this is an anti-Semitic misconception.
No, it's
It's
not.
let me say something here.
Okay.
It's tribal in the sense that the ancient Jewish tribes believed, the children of Israel believed, that they had a mission from God to preach to the world, not because they were superior to anybody or because they were somehow different as human beings, but because they had an extra layer of responsibility at Sinai to do good and to rise spiritually so that they can be an example to all of mankind, not to control people,
To
not to
convert
be
the world.
separate. And by the way, there was always been converts into Judaism. It's not really, this is a big myth, like Ruth and like the multitudes that came over from Egypt.
There's no
There's a
question that
process
there's
there. It
converts
has
and
to do more with a
intermarriage.
covenantal relationship than with any particular ethnic thing. I mean, that's part of it, but
But
it's not
Jews are the chosen people under your own
chosen to
religion.
serve God, not
Yeah,
to control man.
well,
We're chosen
we won't have
to.
to get into that.
No,
But
I will get into that.
God chose them. Look, I don't believe in these kind of wild metaphysical anti-Semitic types of things. But I'm just saying, in terms, I mean, Jews are a chosen people. They are not meant to convert the rest of the world to Judaism. Now, you could say that they want to be a shining light to the rest of the world,
Right.
but they basically wanted to maintain tribal. Which again, in Judaism, the tribe and the religion are
So
deeply
to maintain
interwed. It
spiritual
was to
separateness in the
maintain
Holy Land.
the coherence of the Jewish people vis-a-vis Gentiles. I mean,
Yeah,
we
but
celebrate
it's based upon
Purim.
spiritual ideas more than
Sure,
ethnic. It's
sure.
this idea that there's supposed to be a separate nation to preach and to serve God and to try to elevate the spirituality of mankind, and that was grafted in by Jesus's ministry to the rest of the world.
Are
It's not.
why did the Jews reject Jesus?
Well, I mean, because at the time they did not believe that he was the Messiah. That's why. I mean, it's not that they were rejected him. His ministry actually is quite consistent with Judaism, but they just did not believe that he was what Christians say he was, a man, a God, a son of God, and all of that. It doesn't mean that they rejected his ministry, which was actually consistent with the Torah, and that Jesus, in a sense, regardless of the religious and the theological questions, he brought Jewish ethics and morals to the world. And in that sense, he's the most important man in Jewish history, I guess, or even in world history.
I don't disagree with that assessment. I also don't disagree with the assessment that Christianity is deeply derived from Judaism. It's a to use a German.
It's a form of Judaism.
What?
It's a form of Judaism.
Yeah, I mean, to use a German philosophical conception, it is a Aufhebung, which means a kind of cancellation but fulfillment at the same time. Jesus, you could say, turned Judaism inside out. It was a religion that was about a chosen people, that was God, that had a special covenant with God, that also was it wasn't probably originally like this, but it originally rejected a pagan ideal that was a European concept of respecting
Yes, it
other
did.
gods,
Yep.
unifying them in a pantheon, you could say. The Jews were never had a place in that. It was one God.
Right.
But
That's right.
this or what Jesus became kind of turned this inside out, and so it was a
I don't think it. I think it expanded it. It expanded the covenant and the mandate of the covenant to all of mankind, is what it did. I mean, it didn't.
Do you think Jesus was the Son of God? I'm genuinely
No,
curious.
I think that as a Jew, the covenant continues as is. I think God has a reason for that, but that doesn't mean that the covenant hasn't been expanded by the ministry of Jesus. I know that sounds a little contradictory, and that's the way it is with different religions. But the point is, in a practical sense, the ministry of Jesus, and I think Jesus himself, I don't know, but I think that he took the Torah precepts, the moral and ethical precepts, which lead to the enhancement of the individual sovereign under God, and he gave it to the rest of the world. And he certainly it took root in Europe. And, it expanded the mandate of freedom and of individual identity under God. The whole concept of Christianity is a personal relationship with Christ, with God through Christ as an intercessor, not as an ethnic thing. I mean, there's nothing in Christianity that says you have to be part of a particular tribe.
Well,
It enhances, and in fact, that's the secret sauce that made Western civilization what it is. That was what gave birth to the United States. The idea that the individual under God is someone who can realize themselves, have a sovereignty over their own life and over their own destiny, and that we set up governments to protect those rights. It's not just because someone happens to be born of a certain, racial group. It's not relevant. It's there, but it's not in a matter of faith and politics. It's not the relevant factor.
Previously, you actually said that the United States was a rejection of Europe, that it was an attempt to get away.
Well, it was an advancement from Europe, I would suggest. It progressed from the European model, which was absolute government, divine right of kings, and it moved toward a republican form, which actually is more consistent with the true nature of Christianity.
Oh, God. Okay. Let me just go on this for a little bit. I actually agree with you to a certain extent. I do think that the early Puritans, not so much the founding fathers, who were a different breed, you could say, but the early Puritans, John Winthrop and so on, did see this shining city on a hill. It was not a way of making America open to everyone. It was a place for them to have a rather extremist cult of puritanical Christianity that was rejected, and that was in a way not part of a more organic conception of church and state that was expressed in Britain, in the sense that the Church of England was a natural expression of a people. That is, the Church of England, which still is still embodied to a parodic degree, I guess, in the current Church of England and Episcopalian Church.
Mm.
was an expression of a people and a culture. There was a deep connection. The separation of church and state is what one could argue whether this was ever imagined in the way by the founding fathers, at least in the way that we think of it now. But it's a completely unnatural concept. The
Oh,
church
I
and the
reject
state,
that.
the church and the state are almost universally aligned. I say this as someone
They're
who
aligned, but they're separate also. I mean, yeah, we were animated by
yeah, it's
Christian
distinction, not
ideals,
difference.
but the actual formal existence of a state church is something that, on a national level and a constitutional level, wasn't there. It was there on the state level, and the states gradually left that model.
I'm talking
But
about world history. Throughout world history, there is a basically there's a constitutional, I guess, it's amendment. There will be no national church in the United States.
right,
There actually were much smaller
there were
entities
state
that were
churches.
state
Yeah,
churches. Yeah, and this is
but that
again
faded away over the decades.
concept of the separation of church and state. The church and state throughout history, going back certainly to the ancient world and elsewhere, were aligned. Yes, they were somewhat separate, but the church and religiosity gave legitimacy, gave a sense of belief and belonging to the state. It added power to the state,
But
and
it was
the
separate from
state
the
added
state.
power to the church. You talk in terms of like ideals as if we've always lived in this 20th and 21st century America, where you can kind of choose your own church, go to a mega church here, become an Episcopalian, maybe look into Buddhism or what. This is not how the world has
That's
worked.
how America's worked.
It's not how
America's the exception. That's why we're the exceptional nation. And it's also consistent with Christianity. I'll point to Jesus saying, "Give unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and give unto God that which is God." That's established this concept that there's a separation between Caesar and God.
Throughout the history of Christianity, the church was connected very often with the aristocracy, almost always with some kind of state or ruling order.
Which was rejected by the founding fathers. That's what made us. This is where the United States separated from Europe. This is why we progressed. We took European concepts and we advanced them by further developing what's natural, I think, to human beings, and which is the core of Christianity as well. And that is that the individual is sovereign and that the individual has a personal relationship or not with a creator, with a divine being. It's not a state matter. I mean, that's one of the great gifts that the United States has given to the world.
The history of Christianity. I admire Christianity, the development of Christianity in all its forms. And I think there's actually a great deal to admire within Orthodox Christianity, within the Catholic Church. I even find, even though I'm more critical, I actually find a lot of virtue in Protestantism. And again, actually, after the wars of religion, the Westphalian system was again a connection between a prince and a particular brand of.
That's right, which is rejected by America. But
this is look. You look at America, or you look at all of world history. Which is a more natural state of being? And secondly,
the American way. The American way is more natural, and it's an advancement. It's because it gets into the true nature of the human being, which is to not have a collective control either by a faith or by an ideology like communism, but to have an individual right under God, and that the state is there to protect those rights. That's what makes America what it is, and it's, in a sense, it's a very good reflection of the best aspects of, and probably the worst aspects of, human nature. Worse in that we're here free to fail too, and do it and sin.
Even within the United States, there was effectively a kind of state religion, which was you could say a bit whitewashed, but was a generic high church Protestantism. Now, this is now
culturally, that's true. I don't know if it's theologically, but yes, culturally, I would say America is a small p Protestant.
Yes.
And that we embraced, the principles that were articulated by Martin Luther and by, the Protestant reformers, and that their version of Christianity, which is a much more localized Christianity where people could directly read the Bible and have more of a personal relationship with God. And the Luther and them, they were state, they became state religions. America advanced from that, however. by basically getting rid of that. And the founding fathers and the founding generations rejected that. That's why they came here. They didn't want to live under the
came here to
yoke of
establish
the Anglican Church.
they
That's the
yes,
Pilgrims.
but they came here not to establish religious freedom. They came here to establish tightly knit, almost religiously totalitarian Puritan communities.
Yeah, but that vanished within a generation. You're right, they did. And some of them did, some didn't. I would say Rhode Island didn't. But the point is that vanished within a generation. They started out that way because they wanted to be free from the Church of England and set up their own theocracy. But that went by the wayside pretty much by the turn of the 16th century. I mean, that's something that faded out because of the experience of being here, because of the emergence of the small farmer, the small businessman, the individual, the different types of churches. Each of the colonies had its own church, and eventually that faded away. I mean, that we evolved from that. By the time the Republic was established in 1776, that was gone.
I don't think we're disagreeing totally on facts. I think we're disagreeing on interpretation of facts, basically one's perspective on facts. What you say is more or less correct. This is what my claim is, and that is even if there was not a state and church connection in the way that there was in England and Britain and throughout Europe and throughout the development of European history, there was an implicit and sometimes explicit white Protestant state church. You could see this well into the mid 20th century, and it's now fading away. Now,
it's culturally true, and the whiteness has nothing to do with it. Culturally, we've embraced a Protestant Anglo view, Anglo-Saxon view. That's what I do believe. This country is a Protestant country with a small p. But Protestantism is available to anyone, regardless of their ethnic background. And I don't mean that. I don't mean Protestant in the formal sense that you become a Protestant. I mean culturally. Like, I would consider myself to be culturally a Protestant, even though I happen to be a Jew.
Right.
I mean, and as I would say the same thing about most Catholics. It's an idea. We've embraced certain principles that have nothing to do with our ethnic background.
These principles, this whole cultural and religious world came from somewhere. It emerged from a historical experience, and it emerged from an extended family. That is, you could say.
Yeah, but you want to go backwards. You want to go back to you're idealizing something that you see in the past that I think you've almost fetishized as an ideal, when in fact, because of those very ideals, because of those very ideals that you're talking about in the past, the better aspect of them, we've advanced. And those ideals, even back then, had more than a kernel of principle, which was that the individual is sovereign, and that was a natural progression. This country, our society, our civilization has progressed to the point where we are admiring and acknowledging and venerating the right of the individual to be free and to control their own life and destiny. And you're trying to go back to some kind of a collective past, which didn't really exist in the formal sense. And in the process, you're polarizing the country into collectivized and balkanized categories. Now, I want to bring things up to the present time. Okay, you want to go into this collectivist.
You're kind of lecturing me here. I am not a conservative in the worst sense of the word, that I fetishize, say, a decade of time, whether it be the 1950s or the 1850s or the 1750s, and I just want to roll back the clock and then break the clock and just keep it right there. That is not how I think.
I don't think that's conservatism
I have an evolutionary concept of history, and I also have a concept where I value the future in a way more than the past. But we need to learn from the past. We need to learn from previous previous social and cultural forms. One of the reasons why the United States is a rather unhappy country right now, and I think you would probably agree with me, one of the reasons is that we have lost this base homogeneity that actually kept the republic together. We cannot build a republic just purely based on a kind of cocktail of French Enlightenment, Anglo-Protestant, and European, and maybe a little Catholicism ideals thrown in. That is that we can just convince everyone to believe in it. First off, those ideas came from somewhere. They came from a cultural and a racial world. They emerged from a people. Secondly, that is not how nations of the past held together and congealed and remained strong and actually sought out quite explicitly a future for their children. States and conservatives within states defended people's lands and their posterity, their children, or their class in many ways. I mean, a true conservative has to defend something. If we're just a nation based on some half-remembered ideas from a former white past, this is going to ultimately fragment. I agree in a way that the white race and a lot of our ideas have won in this sense. American culture, you could say Hollywood and so on, is everywhere. When I was in Japan last summer, you saw posters for some Japanese films, tons of posters for basically American films with Japanese subtitles. People are wearing suits. This is a fashion that emerged in the 19th century in Europe and so on. English, business English, at least, has a kind of lingua franca quality to it. I actually went to a symphony orchestra concert that played some Japanese and Western music. Yes, there is a cultural, you could say, global hegemony to so much of the West. No question. But even within that, Japan is still Japan. China is still China. China is kind of is China with some Western characteristics. It is still a fundamentally different concept of what a man is, what being is, what culture means, what people's duties are. I respect that. I don't really actually want to change them. If they want to adopt some things, some trinkets from the West or culture from the West, go for it. I don't care. But the fact is, they are going to remain coherent communities. We, as Europeans, need to also remain coherent. We can adopt some ideas from other places. We can have certain liberal ideas. We can be individualists. But there has to be something congealing this. There has to be some grounding for us to maintain an order that is better for my children. When I look at what is happening in the United States and around the world, when I look at Muslim rape gangs in the UK, while they're arresting some YouTube star for doing an amusing joke, when in the United States, where some even small towns, not just big cities, small towns, are just being transformed. They're becoming Hispanic. They're becoming fundamentally different. I don't look at this and say, this is going to be great for my white grandchildren and their grandchildren. I look at this and say, my white grandchildren and great-grandchildren are going to be a hated minority in a land that used to be ours. I have responsibility to the past, but I actually have more responsibility to the future. I am not going to throw away a great country, a great place for my grandchildren to live in because of some cute idea about individualism. And I will say this, and this might shock you. If what needs to be done in order to maintain order and maintain the future for the white race would entail throwing the entire Constitution out the window, I would absolutely do it. There is
Very
no
un-American.
higher ethic than survival. There is no higher goal than survival.
And what would you replace it with? I shudder to think. Look,
the Constitution doesn't have much effect on the government now. We have the largest, most.
So you should agree. You think we should have a new form of government? I mean, you're un-American. All right, let me.
Matter.
Yeah, I think the Constitution continues to be the law of the land, and it continues to stand.
Really?
But yes, really. But you bring up some interesting points in terms of what is it that creates a cohesive America, and the cultural elements are there. You know, we have a common language, which I think is important, so we can talk to each other without balkanizing into different language groups. I'm against, the kind of the multicultural thing because, to my way of thinking, we have an American culture, however that is defined, and that people's cultures from the nation of which they the parents came over is something that, I mean, Washington addressed this in his farewell address. It's personal, it's who you are, but that's fine. But that's the bigger issue is the American culture first, and the English language. It happens to be the language of our land first as well. If our founding fathers spoke Swahili, we'd be having Swahili, but they happen to speak English. So English is the means by which we talk to each other. And as long as we can talk to each other, we're going to have some cohesion. And I think that we support, wait a minute, we support concepts of national sovereignty in that we support the right of a nation to control its own borders and decide who enters and who doesn't enter the national home, like any sovereign nation. That's just part of any basic functioning nation. In the same way we decide who enters our own private property, the nation acts as our national property, and it's part of property rights. And there are a lot of other things, Judeo-Christian values, all of these things create a cohesive society in which we can communicate with each other. We can have a system of justice, a system of law and order. But it has nothing to do with whether or not we're white.
Where would you rather live?
Why is that a value? Why is being white a value in itself? Putting aside, we've already talked about your conception that Western civilization emerged from Europe, and that you consider Europe to have been white, even though, frankly, the founding fathers didn't. But putting that aside, no, they didn't. They thought England was white. But my question to you is, what is, you seem to think that there's some great virtue in being white. I mean, how do you know? I mean, how do we even know that you're white? Did you have a DNA test?
Yes, I actually have that at 23.
What percentage are you of white?
99.4 or something like that.
So who is that one snuck into the genetic line?
Oh, well, it doesn't. I mean, who cares in a way? Like if
apparently you do.
No, I'm actually.
And why does this matter? I mean, why is this relevant?
Are you proud to be a Jew?
Of course, but I'm proud to be an American. My personal relationship with my faith and ethnicity is personal.
Why can't
as a public matter, I am proud to be an American.
You demean my look. I have if you go to my immediate family.
Yeah, but being white is not a religion. It's not a faith. It's genetic.
Judaism, the Jewish people are a genetic concept.
No, they're not.
Oh God!
You can be.
You can't.
Listen, Richard. You could.
Can you be an atheist yet a Jew and become a citizen of Israel?
Yeah, but you can also convert to Judaism. You could convert to Judaism, Richard, if you wanted to go through the process, and people do.
Conversions to Judaism are minimal in comparison with the other.
But it's there and it's available. It's always been done. Look at Ivanka Trump.
It's not encouraged, and it is not.
It's not encouraged. In fact, it's discouraged. But the point is that you can. Yeah, but the point is it's available, and people have done it in every generation. Okay. It's just it's something that. In fact, one of the rabbis at the Western Wall, he's one of the most fervent rabbis, is a former Lutheran minister from Germany who converted to Judaism. It's very interesting.
Profound guilt complex going on with that person.
No, he's he visited Israel and he realized that the Jewish covenant was the way to go for him. That's a personal matter.
Why is it okay? So you agree with me that Jewry, you could say, is not just a religion. It is a people, or maybe a collection of three peoples: the Sephardim, the Ashkenazi, and the Mizrahim, I believe, the Oriental or Middle Eastern Jews. Do you agree with me that Judaism is not merely an abstract religion, but is actually a people?
Yes, I do.
Okay. You're proud.
Not particularly. I mean, I recognize the right of the Jews to have a sovereign state in Israel. Yeah, okay. I mean,
do whites have a right to have a sovereign state?
I don't think being white. Look at it. I mean, am I white? Being white is it's not a body of belief. Judaism has certain belief systems, certain principles, certain moral and ethical codes of belief. You're right. You can have a completely atheistic Jew that, because their mother is a Jew, they can become a citizen of Israel. That's true. But
Europeanism is a worldview. I agree. It's not dogma in the sense that Judaism is, even though not all Jews believe in the dogma. In terms of the United States, I would probably say the majority of Jews are effectively secular atheists or whatever. But it is, I agree that Europe isn't a dogma in that sense. It's not doctrinal. I don't want it to be. I think it actually should be more about spirit and worldview. There is a
But it isn't.
European.
It's about ethnic background. A German is German, and Italian is an Italian. I mean,
So you
these
think
are.
those are coherent concepts?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So
I mean, they're culture, they're coherent concepts in that over centuries, these groups of people developed a culture, a language, and the various other characteristics that led them to develop a sovereign state.
Germans be able, in your mind, to have a sovereign state based on Deutsches Blut, that is a genetic, familial connection with one another, and to actually exclude people from entering their state on that basis?
Well, I mean, you're getting into, I think Nazi ethnic theory. This is National Socialism.
Pre-existed Nazis, certainly.
But yeah, the point, but the thing, Germany, like any other sovereign nation, has a right to decide who enters the national home. That's a basic function of any sovereign nation, and you don't have to explain why. Any more than I, as an individual, don't have to explain why I'm not going to let someone come into my home. That's it's natural to the human.
Israel?
Excuse me?
Because I agree with liberal values, more or less. If you look at the way I live my life, I more or less agree with liberal values.
Right.
Could I just become a citizen of Israel?
Probably not, unless because Israel's a Jewish state, and Israel's not America.
Right.
I would not support that for America. Great Britain, Great Britain is an Anglican state. You have to be Anglican to be prime minister of Britain. That's what they do. I mean, that's not America, however.
You're playing like 3-card Monte or whatever.
Not at all.
Cup and ball, where's the ball? You're changing all of these concepts. All I am saying is that states exist to perpetuate territory, that perpetuate people who are either subjects or citizens in some case, and that they also perpetuate very often classes, that is the elite classes that usually.
Yeah, but we're talking about the United States here, and that's why we're the exceptional nation, because we don't do that.
But we do. We just have this kind of silly notion that we don't.
We don't do it, and it's obvious if you go out on the street and you start meeting people, you'll realize that people of all various ethnic backgrounds and religions are fully Americanized and full participants in the American culture and the American way of life. You can't say that maybe in maybe Israel or in an Islamic state or in China, perhaps. But America, we're the exceptional nation.
I'll just say this and we can move on. But first off, the United States is very quickly balkanizing. I do not think the United States is becoming.
Yeah, thanks to people like you.
Because of people like me.
And Louis Farrakhan. I would argue that the ideas that you're embracing and Farrakhan are not American. They're anti-American. I want to talk, because we're reaching toward the end of the program, Richard, so I want to get into exactly what you have in mind.
I think
for America,
Americans would agree with me far more than they would agree with.
Whether they agree or not, it's not the American ethos to have, people being collectivized. The collectivism is something the founding fathers rejected. But I want to talk about what you see in today's world, where you see the country going. You said that you would actually look to abolish the U.S. Constitution because you think it's been flawed or it's been compromised. What would you replace it with? Do you want to have should everybody have a DNA test and figure out who's white? I mean, should we have people who you deem to be white? Are they going to have special rights in the United States? Are people who are of color not going to have rights?
I don't seek to abolish the Constitution. I merely said that the Constitution should not be the highest concept in terms of survival. I want to, if it were,
I reject that.
If there were a conflict, and there need not be one, but if there were a conflict between the survival of a people and the survival of a legal document, I know which side I'm on. I'm going to support the people. I actually think the Roman.
Why would it be contradictory? Why do the two things contradict? How would the Constitution deny survival?
Cincinnatus Roman concept of dictatorship is actually a very reasonable one, in which there are states of exception, in which the whole people and civil order is at threat, And in those cases, one must act extra legally. So I agree with that. And all I am saying is the Constitution is perfectly fine. It has not actually been the most effective document in the world. We have the largest welfare surveillance apparatus in the history of mankind, and yet we have a constitution. There are plenty of other countries
because
that
we've
don't have
betrayed our Constitution.
well,
I mean,
okay, sure, but there are plenty of other countries that don't have constitutions that actually don't have this level
like
of
Andorra,
bureaucratic
maybe.
corruption that we do. Secondly, there are also countries that have a constitution, literally have the United States Constitution, more or less. Liberia is one. And so I would ask you, in terms of Liberia, they embraced Judeo-Christian values and a constitution. But where would you rather live in Liberia or say Sweden, despite all of Sweden's faults? I know I can answer that question quite easily. I would much rather live in a white country, even if those whites are a little bit different than I am. There is a general coherency between who I am and who Swedes are. And there is a total incoherency between who I am and who Liberian Africans are. And these coherency, racial and cultural coherencies, overwhelm legal coherencies and values, as you call them.
Well, Liberia, the problem that Liberia's had is that they had an embrace in the 1980s of tribal identity, and it led to very much what you're talking about.
Before the 1980s, let's be honest. And there's no
wait. No, when they assassinated Colbert, they embraced. You had like the tribes come in, and you had tribe was put over what they were trying to do, which was an experiment in an American style constitution. And this kind of tribal identity is more what you're talking about. I would suggest that in America, we've so far avoided those kinds of identities, and we've transcended them. They're there. We all have them, but they're personal. It's not as a matter of a national policy. We embrace the individual as sovereign and who they are, not what they when they were born in a certain ethnic background.
We had that luxury because America was a more or less homogeneous society. When you look at the American nation in the 20th century, particularly after the 1924 Immigration Act, which, by the way, was racially restrictionist, actually even ethnically restrictionist, the American nation emerged as a coherent concept that was white and Christian. Ethnic rivalries, say English and Italian or English and Irish, regional rivalries started to dissolve. There was a coherent American nation. That gave us the luxury to adopt this language which you want to hold on to. I recognize of Judeo-Christian values and the Constitution, whatever. I recognize the serious crisis that has been brought on by A, the immigration system since 1965, but B, just this globalized world in which one can hop on a plane for $350 and be in another a country or even racial context. The fact that we can, through the internet or broadcast television and so on, that we're kind of in touch with what's going on around the world. I recognize this absolute crisis. And what I am saying is that these old values that you used to have the luxury of holding. I mean, you're older than I am. You grew up in effectively a homogeneous white community, I would imagine. I don't think you grew up in, East Harlem or something. But that was a luxury that we could hold. We can no longer have this luxury. I don't want to go back to the past. I want to go forward into the future, recognizing historical developments, the fact that we are going to have a new consciousness based on changes. If we continue to yammer on about individualism and how Judeo-Christian values, we are going to be crushed, absolutely crushed in the coming America, because we are going to act like individuals while everyone else, including Louis Farrakhan, including the Democratic Party, is the POC party,
yourself,
so on. We will be absolutely crushed as individuals. We must embrace a collective familial identity if we are going to perpetuate
No,
our
I
roles
still I
passed
still
on to our children.
admire. I think we can still embrace, because ultimately the idea of the individual, besides that we should support that, I think it will and has prevailed in this country because it's right and because it's most consistent with the best aspects of human nature. And as far as you're talking about immigration, I mean, look, the United States has absorbed immigrant groups going all the way back to the 1830s immigration of the Irish, who back then were not considered white, as
They
you
were.
say.
They
And it
were.
was a very difficult
Why were they
development.
here then? There was a law in
They came here
1790 that
because of the
said
potato
only
famine.
whites
But
could
the
move.
point, they came here with the same reason anyone wants to come here,
No,
because
no,
it's a
no.
great
Why were
place
they
to come.
allowed in? The 1790 Immigration Act. I'm forgetting the right. There's a technical term
Look,
for it.
my point here, Richard, is that
Only white people
this
can immigrate.
country has
They were
absorbed
Irish
immigrant
Dutch
groups.
immigrants. They weren't white.
This country has absorbed immigrant groups
Don't answer.
throughout history, going back to those times, going back to the German immigration, and that there have been tensions. There are issues of cultural conflict and different inconsistencies in our, as you say accurately, our Protestant ethos, and people coming in from other parts of the world who have a transition in terms of their ability to embrace those ethos, but eventually they do. And the Irish certainly did. I mean, in the late 19th century, we had an influx here in New England, where I am, of French Canadians, and there was hostility and there was comments about them being swarthy and this kind of thing. But they embraced American values and they assimilated. Maybe they maintained an ethnic identity. Some did, some didn't. But the point is, America has a history of immigrant groups coming. There's tensions, but they eventually embrace these American ideals that I'm talking about, which are the future. You want to go back to this kind of, image of some kind of balkanized country where different groups are going to be separated and viewed as having some
Reality.
inherent differences. And in that sense, you're no different than these ethnic studies groups on liberal college campuses, who actually believe that there are differences between black people and white people, or between Muslims and Christians in the ethnic sense. There
Could I
are
address
different.
that? There is an actual interesting contradiction within the left at the moment. And I also agree that campus culture is absolutely stifling. Despite what you might say, when I go on
Yeah, but what
to,
about ethnic culture? I'm talking a specific thing here.
I'll go back to the ethnic question if you want, but I'm just going to address
Thank
this
you.
for now. When I go into a campus, you might say that, oh, they should all agree with you because you're both racial or all racial nationalists or so on. No, in fact, there are 500 black clad Antifa standing outside of a building at which I'm scheduled to speak, and so I am not allowed. Eventually, people are afraid to enter, and I can't hold a proper conference. This happens to me. It happened to Jordan Peterson, even, who's very different than I am. It happened to Christina Hoff Sommers, who's very, very different than I am. The
Right.
fact is, there is
Louis Farrakhan.
it doesn't happen to Louis Farrakhan. They're not the Antifa don't come out and
No, but
protest.
I don't think he's well received on college campuses, at least
I
as far
actually
as
think
I
he would be
know.
pretty well received. I think he would be given a respectful
Very
greeting,
well may be,
and
but the
I
point
don't
is,
actually have a problem with that.
and I agree with you that they should have speakers on the campus, and this is a radical movement. But
Right.
I'm getting into a more philosophical question here, which is that even though they think they disagree with you, there's a similarity that I see. There is this
Yes,
embrace
I
of
agree.
collectivism.
I
There is this
agree. And
idea that somehow someone's ethnic background means something about who they are in the literal sense,
I hear
as
you. I'll
opposed to
address
whether or not they embrace it. And that is an un-American idea. That is dangerous to this country.
it's not un-American, but I will address this concept because it's actually very interesting. It's something that I want to write more about. There is an interesting contradiction within the global left, where on the one hand, they are united by an anti-white animus, and that is clear as day. On the other hand, they'll make gestures towards radical individualism, and I think they kind of want everyone to be of different skin tones, but to be basically saying the same things. They're contradicting that way.
Yeah, but how's that any different than what you embrace, which is a pro-white animus? I mean,
My
it's the
speech.
same
Please
flip
allow me.
side of the same coin.
Please allow me to finish.
Sure.
I'm setting something up if you just
All
allow
right,
me
go
to
ahead.
finish.
Yep.
So there's some interesting contradictions within the global left. It's a cocktail of a anti-white animus that unifies all of these people, a certain gesture towards radical individualism and postmodernism and the rejection of history and all these kinds of things. But there's this other element to it, which is identity. I actually agree with you that there are some similarities between what I am saying, what say a black nationalist says, and what even an ethnic studies, professorial loon at Berkeley says. Now, there are some similarities in the sense that even within this postmodern world, there is some need to ground all of this and to say that no, you aren't just an American citizen who has a passport and pays taxes. You're actually an African American. You have roots. You're an Indian American. You're an Asian or a Chinese American. You actually have roots and history. So there's sort of interesting contradictions within the left. The fact is, the reason why they call upon this identitarianism, not for whites, but for every other group, is because it's real and everyone resonates with it. It's one of the reasons why the left is actually attractive to a whole host of people. The one exception is white people. White identity and consciousness is not allowed. It's not just Richard Spencer who has wild ideas about the ethno-state. If just an average sophomore posted a flyer that said it's okay to be white, the most defensible statement imaginable, he would be attacked, sent to a disciplinarian, even a psychologist, to learn what is the matter with this. There would be campus meetings in which people would pray or vent about how oppressed they are because someone just said this. So there is an identitarian quality to the left. Very interesting. But what holds the left together, that whole people of color coalition, is anti-white animus. And we need to recognize.
Fine. I mean, I reject both sides.
Saying, let's all be individuals. We need to solve it by confronting it. Like this is
with more of the same. I mean, you're confronting their racial hyper awareness with your own racial hyper awareness, and both sides are wrong.
We'll win because we're better. Like I don't know what
No,
to say.
you're not better than anybody. Both sides are wrong. Both sides are un-American, and both sides are not the future, which is the individual emerging.
Why whites are not allowed to join in the big table of multiculturalism and multiracialism is because they know that when we do that, when we have a very strong sense of ourselves and so on, we can absolutely dominate the entire world. And we have done that in the past.
Well, that's a war that I'm hoping this country avoids. And I think both sides are wrong. You're wrong, and the multiculturals are wrong. How somebody relates to whiteness or colorness or whatever their background is, again, that's a personal matter. It does. I don't deny the fact that
it animus come from. Like and whites have it as well. Why, like what I do, I do feel like with my movement that I'm banging my head up against the wall just on a daily basis. Being a identitarian, being alt-right right now is really frustrating, actually. And it's frustrating to a large degree because of people of color, but it's actually mostly frustrating due to white people. It's frustrating due to certain Jews as well, who have that's a different story. But it's frustrating mostly because of white people and their guilt complex and their absolute refusal to recognize the world in which we live in and embrace who we are, to actually work together as a community, moving in a direction. This is the absolute most frustrating thing that I have to deal with. And again, why are we the only people who have been given this guilt complex, been called the cancer of humankind and so on, that we need to
look, I mean, I agree with that as well, but
slavery and the Holocaust and all this kind of stuff, because again, it is recognized by others, whether it's conscious or mostly unconsciously, that when we have a sense of ourselves, we can achieve absolute greatness. If we are weighed down by this guilt complex, we are going to run this country into the ground as whites. When we have that guilt complex lifted, when it's cleared from our minds, we are going to be colonizing space. These are the stakes.
Yeah, but it's not whether or not someone's white or not doesn't mean they can't go into space. But Richard, look, we're reaching toward the end of the program. I think that things like slavery and holocausts and whatnot, those are things that happen in societies because a particular group does become dominant, and they become convinced of their own superiority in that dominance, which helps them justify these kinds of crimes. And I even include non-ethnic groups, like, for example, communism is based upon this idea that you can kill people based on their class because you're trying to create a new order. These ideas are rejected by the American Republic. I mean, and by the advance of Western civilization, which has moved away from these kinds of power blocks that have dominance over others, and that have moved toward individual rights. And that things like ethnic identity, even religion, these things are more seen as the right of the individual personally. And I think that is the progressive future. I believe in that future. I don't believe in a future where we're going to go back to tribalism and identity based upon the accident of our birth. I think that it's obvious and self-evident that that's as false a paradigm as is communism, frankly.
Isn't it amazing that the world is headed in the direction that I am describing? It is headed in terms of
thanks to people advocate what you're advocating.
It's headed, and it's not because of me as much as
not
I want
because
to
you
give
personally, but
credit for
it's because of
the
people
world.
like it's no. Of course it's not. But it's because of ideas that you've embraced and ideas that the radical left has embraced and have done so for self-serving reasons and have tried to subsume the individual who's trying to achieve and control and determine their own life and their own destiny. Anyways, Richard, we've reached toward the end of the program. You're with the who are you with, the alt-right group? You might as well just mention that.
Yeah, sure. You can check out my videos at altright.com. I'm the president of the National Policy Institute. I'm actually publishing books as well, Washington Summit Publishers and Radix. Mm-hmm. So Google all of these things. It seems like most of what I do now, previously I spent a lot of times writing and so on. It seems like most of what I do now is actually stuff like this, engaging with people whom I wasn't engaging with in the past, and it's a lot of fun.
Great, and I've enjoyed the talk, and hopefully we'll do more of it. It's part of what I'm trying to do here in this show, to understand what people believe in and why. Anyways, again, Richard, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.